Welcome to the podcast of Data and Analytics in Business. We'll learn from the leading industry experts using data and analytics to solve the problems and create values in practice. We'll also learn where the industry is heading to and how data and analytics will shape the industry in the future. Most importantly, how they are preparing their business for digital transformation and disruption in the future. I'm your host, Jason Tan, and thank you for listening. Hello, I'm your host, Jason Tan. In this episode 51 and also the next episode 52, I have a very, very special treat for you. As I have been unwell and under the weather for a few weeks, my friend Nguyen has kindly to guest host these two episodes for me. The format is still remain the same, and Eric is going to interview and sharing with you some of the analytic practitioner and how they use analytics to create more business value. I have already listened to the pre-recording, and I'm super excited to have Eric sharing his interview with you. Without any further delay, I'm going to leave this on the hand of Eric, and I hope you enjoy this episode. And make sure you follow Eric and his guests, and follow us at the Analytic Show podcast. Thank you.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Analytic Show. I am your guest host, Eric Nguyen. In this episode, Analytics, Catalyst for Change Beyond the Math, Dashboard and Report, we have Dr. David Schmidtchen, partners of Synergy Group. David Schmidtchen has had a varied career as an army officer, management consultant, and public servant. Currently, David leads Synergy's creativeXpeople practice in Canberra, working with government clients, focusing on behavioral change through effective messaging and organizational design. We have a great show for you today, especially 3 things about analytics that David shared: a COVID-19 story, behavioral change, and workforce management. You don't want to miss it. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Hi, David. How are we?
I'm very well, Eric. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. It is my honor to have you today to join me for the next half an hour to talk about analytics and your expertise around psychology and how these two worlds can collide.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Excellent, thank you. Well, before we start, would you like to share with us your career journey?
Okay. I started life, so I'm an organisational psychologist by background. I joined the Army straight out of university, where I learnt a lot about psychology. So I was in uniform. I did a lot of different sorts of work in there, from everything from recruiting right through to learning and development and training, and then counselling and all those sorts of things. And the last part of my career was very much in the organisational side of technology and the impact on warfighting and those sorts of areas. So I then went into an engineering company where I was the only psychologist in an engineering company, a global engineering company. Learned an enormous amount from them, doing mostly consulting type work. I then joined the public service here in Canberra for 5 years. I worked at the Australian Public Service Commission, where I did a lot of the work across the Commonwealth with different agencies around the human part of public service work, organisations, people, teams, those sorts of things. And I ran the Australian Public Service employee census for those 5 years. Just to give you a sense of what that is, that's at the time it was 256 questions completed by about 100,000 people. So it was a big survey, so lots of analytics and the like went on in that. I then joined one of the global professional services firms and was there for 4 years doing all sorts of different types of work. Those companies provide an enormous amount of opportunity. And then I came here with Sally Dorsett, just the two of us, to start a new business in which we wanted to do something different in the market. We wanted to make a different market offering around people and organisational development, and currently we co-lead Synergy's creativeXpeople practice.
Excellent. Thank you, David. I must say your journey was quite interesting in 2 aspects. One, it is about the reach You reach quite deep in terms of, like, say, in the military, you literally go through the end-to-end cycle of, like, say, when a new recruit start, or even before they start, until the part where they got training, or maybe they will move on to the next stage of their career, or they decide to continue, but in different posts. And then also the part around the APS census as well, with the scale and also the level of details, like over 260 questions.
So the census gave the APS a real opportunity to use analytics to dig into what drives behaviour in the workplace, basically. Now, it's a survey, but it gave real opportunity to find out where the systemic issues were across the departments and agencies in a 150,000 person organisation. So where could the APS invest in order to have the biggest effect on performance and capability? So it fed into that. And I also ran the Australian Public Service Employment Database, which was really a record of all the people who'd been in the public service for a very long time, which allowed us to track movements across the public service. But the advantage of that was it was hardcore personnel data, and we were able to see the effect of policy changes, workforce policy changes, on things like demographics and the shift in the ageing profile, the impact of superannuation policy on people's decision-making around when they worked and when they didn't. So that was another aspect of that work, which was heavily analytic available. A lot of this information is available on the Australian Public Service Commission website if you want to go and have a look at it.
Thank you, David. Well, you just give me so much information that I can easily come with another 2 or 3 more episodes to talk about the nitty and gritty. But maybe before we dive into too much of the details, I'd like to learn more from your perspective as a psychologist, because audience on the show, I don't think many of us will have a chance to talk to psychologists on a daily basis.
As well, mate.
I see. All right. I look at what you show me over here. We see a lot of data, a lot of questions. But what comes to my mind is around, like, say, how do you see the human aspect in analytics? Like, say, when you prepare for those questions, when you prepare for, like, say, an approach or a program, where do you put the human aspect in?
I think one of the things that people who are good at maths and are strong in analytics often make an error in is that they think that a lot of people are like them and are good at maths and analytics. The fact is that not a lot of people process that information terribly well or have the tools to make the judgments and interpretations from data as well as you think they do. So there's a real onus on people who are dealing and working with analytics and presenting that information through dashboards or reports to help people to digest and understand what it actually means. And I know a lot of people do a lot of really good work around this, but more often than not, I see in my own field, for instance, workforce planning. Workforce planning is very numbers heavy. What I really want to know from workforce planning is what's my risk? So how do the numbers, how does the presentation tell me about the risk? The flip side of that is that when you're presenting that information is that you're presenting it accurately, that you're presenting it completely and both sides of the story. So I think that the human side of people's ability to digest numbers, their ability to interpret that information, and then particularly for people who are relying on and making decisions about it, what do they need to understand in order to make those decisions? How can you help them make better decisions using the data? The temptation, I think, for sometimes is because and particularly now that we've got access to just such an enormous amount of data, is that we're indiscriminate about what we present. We need to make real choices about what's available to us and use that which helps us to make better quality decisions.
That's a good point around the decision-making process. I'd like to talk more around that. With your exposure to, I would say, executive leaders at a certain point of your career, how the decision was made in alignment with those facts? reports and number? Would it be like every time people will look up at the evidence base, or they're gonna work around like some option and then evaluate over the time?
So I think the thing for people to keep in mind, particularly at the senior executive level, is that the numbers are only part of the decision-making process. They're one input. The judgments that are made around risk draw on all sorts of other different sorts of inputs along the way. So to say that the numbers speak and then I make a decision is not accurate. And I had a number of times people say to me, well, look, this number, you can't make that decision because for this, there's too much risk in it. Well, as the decision maker, the level of risk that I accept is mine. I make that call. The data doesn't tell me how to make a decision. It informs my decision, and it's only one input into it. It's a very important one because often it's grounded in an evidence base. But one of the things I encourage executives to do is to question the underlying assumptions of the numbers that they're being presented. And I don't think executives, and this is an element of data literacy, executives ask enough questions of analytics people about the assumptions. My advice to people is present your assumptions clearly to the decision makers so they can make better quality decisions. Don't hide the assumptions. We need to know what the quality and the risk in the data is. I always love the historian, a guy named Carr, who said facts are not like fish on slabs. I go through and I pick up a fish on the way. You've got to think about it like I'm in a rowboat and I row out into the ocean and I'm trying to catch a fish. I've got to have a certain type of tackle to catch a certain type of fish. I've got to be in a certain type of place. I've got to have some hypotheses about what I'm doing out there. There's a whole heap of thought that has to go into getting the right data. There's a whole heap of assumptions that are based in getting the right data. So it's not just I'm going around, and big data was like this, I swirl my hand around in the ocean and I pull out some facts from the ocean of data that's available to me. That's not enough. The principles of what's my hypothesis, why am I looking where I'm looking and what am I looking for and what are the tools by which I'm going to catch the thing that I actually need. All of that is an inherent part of presenting and understanding data, I think. And data people are all aware of this because that's their background and training, but sometimes don't take the time to tell that part of the story. They want to get to the meaty bit. Sometimes that background part's really, really important.
I really like the part you highlight around data inform the decision, and it comes with a lot of assumption. One question I can quickly ask you, because it's all relevant to us, COVID-19, back in 2020 in Canberra, in our office we are in right now. Could you share with me a little bit of the decision at that time? Because I believe that we must have through some sort of like discussion with evidence-based decision around whether we stay or we all pack up and go and work remotely.
So it's interesting in that time. So COVID's a good example of not having complete data. It was, particularly in the early part, a very, very uncertain time for everyone involved. In some countries, the UK and France and Italy at the time, it was a clear danger. It was clear and present. It was obvious, and there was a lot more information around about it. In Australia and in Canberra particularly, it was a lot more uncertain because we didn't have that pressure of lots of cases and all those sorts of things. So the decision-making was based on what's right for our people, and then collecting the data as we went to progressively inform our decision-making on the move, which meant questioning it. So there was a lot of stuff at the time coming out from the media. There was a lot of stuff coming out from the Department of Health. That was both in terms of qualitative judgments about and people's opinions. The media stuff at the time, the media in large part was the most informed area at times and the fastest to market with information. But you had to be really critical about what you were hearing. As a company, we took the view that the workforce was the most important element and the well-being of the workforce was the most important element. And then how do we maintain business continuity through this time? We were fortunate to be in a business that allowed us to go remote quickly, and our people just responded magnificently to that. But data helps us to make certainty progressively from uncertainty, and the veracity of the information that we get gets progressively better, but we keep building on what we've already got in place. Part of the challenge of that period, the challenge of uncertainty, is that we need to sometimes change our assumptions along the way, which is a bit challenging because I have a certain set of assumptions that are formed under uncertainty. I get more information. I need a new set of assumptions. So I have to keep altering that. Uncertainty is the thing that does people's heads in most of the time. Most of the time. People are not... It's very, very difficult. And COVID was like a worked example of that.
Wow. Good to hear about our approach and especially the way we make the decision and adjust our assumption.
Yes.
For the best interest of our people rather than based loosely on, let's say, a business decision or like evidence-based itself.
Yeah. No, it was as best we could get. It was evidence-based. Yeah.
Excellent. Now, lately, I've learned that you move into behavioural change. You talk a lot about that topic. I'm keen to learn what is it. What can you tell us in a very simple layman term?
You want it short, don't you, Marek? That's what we're talking about. So, look, if you are doing any sort of strategy, any sort, and the topic is irrelevant, at some point you want somebody somewhere to change their behaviour. There is no point in doing a strategy if you want things to stay the same. So we put in place strategy, we take actions in order to effect a behaviour change somewhere. Quite often when we do that, we often leave the idea of behaviour change to the end of the process. So we do all the work, we do the policy, we do the strategy, we do the implementation, and then at some point somebody says, hey, this is not working so well, so we need to change people's behaviour. Part of Synergy's practice that Sally and I run focuses very much on behaviour change, but puts it up front. It says that if you're going to change behaviour through strategy, then you may as well start thinking about strategy right up front. And that means thinking about people's motivations to change, the attitudes that they have to change, and what's the trigger that's going to get them to change. So I can have all the will in the world to change, but not have the ability or the permission to do it. I can have the ability to change, but not have the motivation to do it. I can have both the motivation and the ability to do it, but not have a reason. And the reason is important because any change that you make in your daily behaviour is a cost to you. You have to do something differently. So you have to potentially give up something in order to do something new. So there's a cost involved. So you have to convince me of that. In organisations, behaviour is strongly built into process, it's built into organisation, it's like fundamentally built into what an organisation is. So changing behaviour becomes really complicated really quickly. Our job is to identify what the motivation is, influence that motivation and those attitudes, and then sometimes to generate the trigger point that is the reason for change. And we have an approach that talks about I have to convince people of the reason to change, I have to engage them in the change, and then I have to show them the first few steps, because you can't just assume that people know what to do or how to do it. But if you give them the first few steps and say, look, this is the path and the permission to do that, then not long after they'll do it for themselves if there's an incentive and a reward in it. Does that help you out, Eric?
Oh, definitely. Definitely. I want to just quickly ask you to clarify the part around motivation to change. Mm-hmm. Would it be something that analytics can give you some insight, or it is purely from hands-on experience, interview, or...
Look, we're dealing with people, so qualitative data is really important in my job. So my background is in qualitative data, unstructured data for those in the analytic world, I guess. That's really important to me, and it helps me, the analysis and the ability to construct concepts and themes out of that are valid and testable is important. Data is important across that entire behaviour change process. So it can tell me if I focus the data collection, it can tell me what the trigger points are. It can tell me where to push. In terms of attitudes and motivation, if we go back to the public service census and surveys of that sort, I can get from that people's attitudes and opinions to change that I can then verify and test in a qualitative sense. More importantly, it can show me where to push. So I don't push on a whole organisation, I push on the component that allows me to have the greatest effect in the direction that I want it to go. So when we do change, we're not necessarily focused on changing everything at once. We're focused on where's that point that if I push on it, the effect will be greatest in the direction that I want to go. And so I think analytics is all through this, all through it. And good quality analytics, particularly in HR and work and people and those sorts of things, is quite difficult to get. Workforce data, people data is really challenging to... It's easy to collect. It's really challenging to interpret. That's been my experience.
I think you refer to what they call storytelling in analytics, isn't it?
Yeah.
You can collect all sort of data point. You can narrate. You have multiple narrative, but in order to bring up the data in a meaningful and purpose, it is difficult. Could you share any kind of tips to the audience around storytelling with data?
I think this is really important. People learn by telling stories. So they learn from stories. We all learn from stories along the way. If we can tell the story around data and around analytics, it helps to engage people in the idea of the thing. Now, you might be saying, well, I just do numbers and that's all I do. Somewhere in those numbers, there's a hero. There's a reason why that thing is a hero. How do you draw that out? Why is it a hero? What's its objective? What's its story arc, if you like? Who are the kind of characters along the way that are...
The villain.
Yeah, who's the villain? Exactly. Who's the villain? Well said, Eric. Who are the supporting characters? All those sorts of things. I think it helps you to see the data through a different set of eyes. The interesting thing about data folk, and it's like all professions, we're all raised to see things through a particular lens. I find the storytelling kind of approach helps you to see your own work in a different way, potentially through the eyes of others, because you're trying to influence them. You're trying to have an effect of some sort, and the story helps you to do that. Brute force of numbers, while you might, and I know I'm talking to a whole heap of analytics folk, brute force of numbers doesn't work. You've got to convince me. I'll ignore numbers all the time.
Let's just, since we talk about data a lot, what do you think of the emerging trend around data-driven business or data-driven organisation or culture?
I think it's a good additional bow. I think particularly people who work with other people often don't have good data skills and they need to have better data literacy. I think that's a real gap at the moment. I think to make that sort of idea of a data-driven organisation, there needs to be more robust data collection and identification. So not everything is important. We need to be able to make sure that the data that we're using is actually the right data. I'm not convinced all the times that we get to that point. It is but one input. An organisation is actually a web of social relationships, not a web of process relationships. If you think about your own organisation, most things get done probably by people talking to people and probably sometimes working around existing process. Data is often bound up in process and those sorts of things. So I like the idea and I'm attracted to the idea, and I'd like to see more robust data and informative data in things like behaviour and culture and those sorts of things. But it will never be the single driver of the work that we do. There's too much human in it.
What if we talk about, like, say, for startup culture, for example, those Nordic European country where they famous for flat structure? Would you think they are more close to that kind of like data-driven business culture?
It's possible. I mean, if you go to a really, really flat structure like you might get out of a lean process, lean is very data-driven in a lot of what it does. It ends up in, if it's done properly, it ends up in very flat structures. You could argue that that's the case. Now, that's in a particular sort of environment. It's often in a production environment, those sorts of things. I can guarantee you that somewhere in there, there are people making decisions that are nothing to do with data. That doesn't mean it can wrong, but there are different sorts of organisational structures that are probably better equipped to use data than others. There are probably particular sorts of environments that are work environments that are better equipped to use data more effectively than others. I think it's, for a lot of the work that we do, we're early days in the data world, really early days. I'd like to see more of it. I'd like to see more efficiency in it, so data leading to greater efficiency and thereby greater performance or improved performance. That would all be fantastic. I think we're a little way off that yet.
Let me go to another topic. I think it's quite interesting because earlier you did mention the term workforce analytics. And throughout my study, you actually lead a group within the APAC region around workforce analytics. Could you share with me and the audience your journey throughout that roles and anything that we can learn from it?
Yeah, I think a lot of what I've already said kind of covers that to some extent, but specifically there was a focus on how do we get more and better quality data, and how do we, really the focus was on the analytics component. How can we get better quality information out of the back end of the data that was collected? But one of the interesting learnings was, as it always is in data, how do you connect different sorts of data together from different areas that might never have touched each other previously to generate a different picture, a different story, a different insight. The real challenge, I think, for the work that everybody in analytics or who touches analytics is to make sure that you see the connection between things. And sometimes that means bringing data together in ways that are often novel and that challenge you to think about what the relationship between different parts of an organisation might be. So I often in that time worked with workforce and some other function like a logistics function or whatever function. My challenge was, what does the workforce data tell me about that function and its performance? And what's the information that they've got that tells me about the workforce? So it flows both ways. Those times were really, really interesting, very challenging, but really interesting.
When you say challenge, do you mean because they're from different, like say, these stakeholders, they're from different area of work, so they don't...
different sorts of data.
Different sorts of data.
They're collected for different reasons. So a lot of workforce data is collected around a process, so it's not actually designed to be analysed, it's designed to be reported, if you like. A lot of the work that we do needs to either collect new data in for the specific reason that we have, or work with data that's been collected for another purpose in order to repurpose it for something else. When you work with another data set, you have to take the time to understand how and why that data set's been collected, what's its actual job of work, and am I using it within the context for which it's been collected, or am I using it to bend it and mash it with something else to get a new insight? And the open question in all that is, have I gone too far? Am I doing the right thing? So there can be great evil in data and analytics.
Definitely. Your answer actually, I think in a way, quite aligned with the topic around digital transformation right now. And everyone talk about tools, better tool, bigger tool set, more expensive program. Would it solve the problem that you mentioned earlier around different set of data? If now they say, hey, we have a big platform, everyone can bring in.
So I think
process.
So if I take in my own world the enterprise resource type data that comes out of those big systems that link things together, the real interesting thing for me is that it starts to connect different sorts of decision makers together, and parts, because the efficiencies inherent in those systems, drop out decision chains. Things where we went from A to B to C to D, we now go to A to D. Now, in the previous way that people worked, A and D never talked to each other. They never met each other because there were all these things in between. So those big platform systems bring efficiencies, but they also bring different relationships within the organisation that actually affect performance. So and they give us different perspectives on how data fits together. So things that were once collected in different silos and packeted around an organisation are now potentially all in mostly one place and can be seen sitting next to each other. And I think there is some real advantage in that. But it puts emphasis on data literacy, and it puts emphasis on being questioning and knowing what the data actually is before jumping to the solution of what it says. So for me, that's the real challenge. It actually puts more pressure on the human in the system to be more questioning of the data that they have in front of them.
What do you think, like say, those platforms, would they be able to give you some sort of like a off-the-shelf function?
Yeah, a lot of them do provide exactly that. They provide a lot of functions. They standardise a lot of things that are currently not standardised, and that's to some extent their great advantage. One of the things that does concern me sometimes with those big data is that misinformation can squeeze into that really quickly. And it's the sort of somebody makes a data entry error somewhere, or that can amplify in the system if it's allowed to accumulate, but it's also very hard to detect. So inadvertent misinformation in a data set is really hard to see because you assume that it's been entered properly and correctly, or it's been picked up and entered properly and correctly. This is what I mean. There's an element of questioning and thoughtfulness that comes with these things because there's a lot of assumption bound up in the back end in the way that they've been designed, in the way that they think the world works, or the designers of them think the world works, and the effect that they have on organisations.
Excellent. So in another word, we just need to be mindful with the data, regardless the size of the system.
Okay.
Thank you, David. So far, so good. May I just wrap up the conversation with one last question? Now I have two questions that you can pick. All right, so two questions that you can pick to answer. One, if people work in analytics today, they work with dashboard, report, and data set, they want to move up to the next level in their career path, what one or two things you can advise that person to look to? Mm-hmm. That's question one. Question two, it is about with the behavioural change concept you introduced earlier as a community of practice in especially with in analytics. What roles can we play in that change?
So let me answer both of those. The first one about as you're going through, and career progression data. I've met a lot of people who are very, very good, who are data specialists in very senior positions now. The challenge for them is to broaden out their knowledge as they go. So if you're going to be an effective senior executive, it's not enough to have one string in your bow. You've got to understand how policy works. You've got to understand all of those things that sit around data. Having data as your core, it gives you an advantage, I think. But if you don't expand your knowledge out about how the things actually work, then you'll be locked into being the data person. And I've seen very senior people who are purely data people, and they go to them for the depth of their expertise. And I've seen people who have data as their core but have expanded out their managerial and leadership brain to accommodate and learned a whole heap of the factors that influence data, and those people have been very, very effective. Behavioural change and analytics, I think that there is huge opportunity in here. A lot of the technology that's coming in is going to give us a whole heap of data that we've never had before. We're going to need people who can educate us on what it means and how to collect it, and work with the processes of making organisations more efficient and effective. And I think analytics from that perspective can inform behavioural change in order to improve capability in organisations, but also improve performance overall. So I think there's huge opportunity in this, huge.
Excellent. Thank you for the wisdom. Well, thank you, David, for our conversation today around analytics, the catalyst for change.
No worries. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.